There are moments in your life that arrive disguised as something ordinary. They were the camouflage of a Tuesday night, or the quiet hum of a refrigerator, or the familiar weight of a body settling next to you on a sofa. You don't recognize them as watershed moments at the time. There is no thunderclap, no sudden intake of breath. The world does not stop spinning. It is only later, when you trace the map of your own heart, that you find the pin marking the exact location where everything changed. For me, that location was my worn, gray couch, and the moment was the first time Ben fell asleep on my shoulder, not as a joke or an accident, but as a destination. It was the beginning of an unspoken language between us, a dialect of touch and proximity that I spent months, years it felt like, desperately trying to translate, terrified of what I might find, and even more terrified of finding nothing at all. His head was heavy against my collarbone, a solid, trusting weight that seemed to anchor me to the spot. The movie we'd supposedly been watching played on, its colored light flickering across his face, illuminating the soft curve of his eyelashes against his cheek. He was so completely still, so unguarded in his sleep, a state I was rarely permitted to see. Awake, Ben was a force of nature, a whirlwind of easy laughter and restless energy. He was the captain of our university's swim team, a leader by instinct, a person who filled every room he entered. Asleep, he was just Ben, the boy who sometimes got a furrow between his brows when he was working on a difficult coding problem, the friend who had a small, almost invisible scar above his left eyebrow from a childhood fall, the man I had been quietly, hopelessly in love with for 2 years. My breath caught in my chest, a fragile, stupid thing. I was a cartographer of his smallest details, a secret historian of his expressions, and this was a new territory, a continent of vulnerability I never thought I would be allowed to explore. I didn't dare move. I just sat there, in the blue-gray light of the television, and let the warmth of him seep into my bones, a dangerous, addictive poison I knew I should resist. But I didn't. I couldn't. I just held my breath and pretended this was ordinary. We had met in the chlorinated sanctuary of the university pool, a place that smelled of clean exertion and damp towels. I was a freshman, awkward and overwhelmed, a photographer by passion and a swimmer by discipline. My camera was my shield, the lens a comfortable barrier between me and the world. I was good in the water, a solid distance freestyler, but on land, I felt like a fish gasping for air. Ben was a junior then, the team captain, and he moved through the world with an uncomplicated grace that I envied. He had the broad shoulders of a swimmer and a smile that seemed to generate its own light. He wasn't just popular, he was genuinely liked. He had a way of making people feel seen, a casual inclusiveness that drew everyone into his orbit. I, content to remain a distant moon, was surprised when his gravity caught me. He noticed my camera first. I was sitting on the bleachers after practice, toweling my hair dry, reviewing the shots I'd taken of the divers, their bodies arcing like taut bows against the stark white ceiling. He sat down next to me, dripping a small puddle onto the bench, his skin still gleaming. He didn't ask what I was doing in that condescending way some people did, as if a hobby was a quaint little affectation. He just leaned in, smelling of chlorine and the cheap soap from the locker room showers, and pointed at the screen. "That one's amazing," he'd said, his voice a low rumble. "You made Martinez look like he can actually fly." I had mumbled a thank you, my cheeks flushing, acutely aware of how close he was, of the way the tiny hairs on his arm were beaded with water. I expected him to move on, to rejoin the boisterous circle of his friends, but he stayed. He asked me about apertures and shutter speeds, about why I liked photography, and he actually listened to the answers, his head cocked to the side, his gaze focused and curious. That was the beginning of our foundation. It was a friendship built in the quiet hours after practice, in the shared exhaustion and the mutual respect of athletes. We discovered a surprising symmetry between us. I was quiet, he was loud. I was an observer, he was a participant. I saw the world in still frames, in compositions of light and shadow. He experienced it as a continuous, kinetic flow. Yet, we found a common language. He would talk for hours about the elegant logic of his software engineering coursework, the beauty of a perfectly written piece of code that could solve a complex problem. I would try to explain the feeling of capturing a perfect moment, the way time could seem to stop inside the frame of my viewfinder, preserving a fleeting expression or a slant of light forever. He understood. He saw the structure in my art, and I saw the art in his logic. We were two different architects designing for the same purpose, to create order out of chaos. My feelings for him didn't arrive in a sudden, crashing wave. They were more like a tide, slowly, imperceptibly rising until I found myself submerged. It was in the small things. The way he'd save me a seat on the bus to away meets. The way he'd bring me a coffee from the campus cafe, remembering exactly how I took it. Black, 2 sugars, without me ever having to ask again after the first time. The way he'd sometimes look at me across a crowded room, his face breaking into a genuine, uncomplicated smile that was just for me. Each of these moments was a small, smooth stone I'd pick up and place in my pocket, a secret weight I carried with me. I built a fortress around my heart with those stones, a structure designed to protect a precious, fragile secret. Of course, there were girlfriends. There was always a girlfriend. They were usually bright, beautiful girls who laughed easily at his jokes and fit perfectly under his arm. I learned to be the supportive friend. I listened to him talk about first dates and anniversaries. I offered advice on birthday presents. I smiled and said she seemed great, and I meant it, in a distant, academic sort of way. Each new relationship was a fresh coat of paint on the wall between us, another layer reinforcing the platonic reality of our bond. I would watch them together, a photographer cataloging details, the way she'd brush a piece of lint from his sweater, the way he'd rest his hand on the small of her back, and I would feel a dull, familiar ache. It wasn't jealousy, not exactly. It was more like a quiet resignation, the feeling of looking at a beautiful landscape through a thick pane of glass. I could appreciate its beauty, but I could never feel the sun on my skin or the wind in my hair. I was the observer, and that was my role. I accepted it. I had to. The friendship was too valuable to risk on the impossible odds of a different kind of love. My feelings were a room in my house that I kept locked. I knew it was there. I was aware of its dimensions and its contents, but I never, ever opened the door. Then came Sarah. She was different from the others. She was a law student, sharp and ambitious, with a dry wit that challenged Ben in a way I hadn't seen before. He seemed more serious with her, more adult. They talked about internships in different cities, about postgraduate plans, about a future that felt tangible and real. For the first time, I felt the foundation of our friendship shift, a subtle tectonic movement beneath my feet. He had less time for our late-night study sessions or spontaneous movie nights. Our conversations became shorter, more functional. The easy, unhurried rhythm of our friendship was replaced by something more staccato. I told myself it was natural. It was part of growing up. People paired off, they built lives. My locked room began to feel colder, the air within it more stagnant. I started to imagine a future where he was just a name in my phone, a Christmas card on the mantelpiece, a fond memory of college. The thought was a physical pain, a hollowness in my chest. The end of their relationship was as swift and brutal as its beginning had been promising. I didn't get the story from Ben, not at first. I heard it in whispers from teammates, saw it in the tight set of his jaw at practice. He moved through the water with a frantic, punishing energy, his strokes choppy and aggressive. He was trying to outswim his own ghosts, but they were faster. The easy light in his eyes was gone, replaced by a storm cloud gray. He stopped smiling. For 2 weeks, he was a ghost in our shared spaces, present in body but absent in spirit. He didn't answer my texts. He didn't return my calls. The silence was a chasm between us, and I was terrified it was permanent. I felt the loss of our friendship as a physical ache, a phantom limb that still throbbed with memory. He had retreated so far into himself that I couldn't find the path back to him. The door to his own fortress was closed, and I didn't have the key. Finally, one night, long after midnight, my phone buzzed. It was a one-word text from him. Here. I looked out my window and saw his car parked at the curb, the engine off. My apartment was a small, second-floor walk-up a few blocks from campus, my sanctuary of quiet and order. He had never just shown up like this before. My heart hammered against my ribs, a frantic bird beating against a cage. I threw on a sweatshirt and went down to meet him. He was leaning against the driver's side door, his hands shoved in his pockets, his shoulders hunched against a chill that wasn't in the air. He looked exhausted, hollowed out. The usual confidence he wore like a second skin was gone, leaving him exposed and fragile. "Hey," I said softly, not wanting to spook a cornered animal. He looked up, and in the dim glow of the streetlight, I saw that his eyes were red-rimmed. He didn't say anything for a long moment. He just looked at me, and in his gaze was a world of hurt, a silent plea that I didn't yet understand. "She's gone," he finally whispered, his voice rough. "She, took a job in Chicago. Left this morning. Said it was for the best." He wasn't just talking about a physical departure. This was a deeper kind of leaving. This was an amputation. Sarah hadn't just broken up with him. She had erased the future he had been so carefully building. He had placed all his blueprints in her hands, and she had simply walked away with them. He looked lost, like a man standing in the empty footprint of a house that was no longer there. "Ben," I said, my own voice tight with an emotion I couldn't name. It was a fierce, protective ache. "Come on. Come upstairs." He followed me without a word, his steps heavy on the stairs. He sank onto my couch as if his bones had turned to liquid. I made him tea, a gesture that felt laughably inadequate. What do you offer a person whose world has just collapsed? A hot beverage felt like a pathetic shield against an avalanche. But he took the mug in both hands, letting the steam warm his face, his knuckles white. He started to talk, and it was like a dam breaking. The words poured out of him in a torrent of confusion and pain. He talked about their plans, the little jokes they shared, the future he had seen so clearly it felt like a memory. He wasn't angry. He was just bewildered. It was the bewilderment that was the most heartbreaking. He kept circling back to the same question, turning it over and over like a smooth, painful stone. I just don't understand why I wasn't enough. I had no answer for him. I just sat with him, listening, my presence a silent testament. I was his anchor in the storm, the one fixed point in his spinning world. As the sky outside began to lighten from black to a bruised purple, his words finally slowed, then stopped. The silence that filled the room was heavy with exhaustion. He leaned his head back against the cushions, his eyes closing. I watched the tension slowly drain from his face, replaced by a profound weariness. He looked younger, more vulnerable than I had ever seen him. After a few minutes, his breathing deepened, evening out into the slow, steady rhythm of sleep. And then it happened. His head, which had been resting against the back of the sofa, slowly tilted to the side, a slow, inevitable slide, until it came to rest on my shoulder. And that was the shift. The catalyst. The moment the tectonic plates of our friendship finally fractured, revealing the molten core of something else beneath. It wasn't a choice he made, not consciously. It was an act of pure, unthinking instinct. He was adrift, and he had found a shore. That shore just happened to be me. I sat there, rigid, my own exhaustion forgotten, every nerve in my body screamingly aware of the point of contact. The weight of his head, the warmth of his skin through his t-shirt, the faint scent of his shampoo mixed with the stale sadness of a long night. It was everything I had secretly wanted and everything I was terrified to have. This wasn't a joke between friends. This wasn't an accident on a team bus. This was different. This was a quiet, desperate turning toward. And in the silent, pre-dawn gray of my living room, the ritual began. It started as an exception, a single deviation born of crisis. That first night, I let him sleep on the couch, covering him with a blanket before I retreated to my own bed, where I lay awake for hours, my mind replaying the feeling of his head on my shoulder. The next day, he was apologetic, embarrassed. He thanked me profusely, his usual confidence still a few sizes too big for him. I brushed it off, told him it was nothing. That's what friends were for. But something had been reset between us. A new permission had been silently granted. My apartment, once just a place we sometimes hung out, became his default location, his sanctuary. He was there most evenings, ostensibly to study or watch a movie, but I knew, and I think he knew, that he was there because he couldn't bear the thought of being alone in his own quiet, empty space. The ritual of the couch became a regular occurrence. We'd put on some mindless action movie or a documentary I wanted to see, and at some point, his energy would just dissipate. The restless tapping of his foot would still. The easy flow of his commentary would trail off. And then, the slow, deliberate lean. It became a pattern I could predict with unnerving accuracy. First, he would shift, turning his body slightly toward mine. Then, a sigh, a sound of deep, boneless weariness. And finally, the gentle, solid weight of his head finding its now familiar place in the hollow of my shoulder. The first few times, my entire body would tense up, my heart a frantic drum against my ribs. I was so afraid of doing something wrong, of breathing too loudly, of shifting and breaking the spell. I was an actor in a play where I hadn't been given the script, improvising my way through scenes of breathtaking intimacy, terrified of missing my cue. I became a scholar of these moments, analyzing every detail for meaning. Was the way he burrowed his face slightly into my neck a sign of deeper trust, or just a reflexive movement in sleep? Was the hand that sometimes came to rest on my thigh a subconscious claim, or a simple, meaningless placement? I was drowning in a sea of ambiguity, and every small gesture was a piece of driftwood I clung to, trying to decipher if it was part of a raft or just meaningless flotsam. My camera, which had once been my primary tool for observation, felt useless. A photograph could capture the image of him sleeping on my shoulder, but it couldn't capture the internal landscape of that moment. The electric current that ran down my spine, the protective urge that swelled in my chest, the quiet, desperate hope that this meant something, that this was the beginning of a new language and not just the babbling of a friend in need. The process was like developing a photograph in a darkroom. The image was there, latent, invisible on the paper. You had to submerge it in the right chemicals, wait patiently in the unsettling red glow, and watch as the picture slowly, painstakingly emerged from the whiteness. These nights with Ben were my chemical bath. Each touch, each shared silence, was another second of exposure, bringing the hidden image into sharper focus. But I was terrified of the final picture. What if it was just a blur? What if it was a portrait of unrequited love, of my own foolish, hopeful projection? The anxiety was a constant, low-grade hum beneath the surface of my days. I was living a double life, the calm, supportive friend on the outside, and a roiling mess of hope and fear on the inside. After a few weeks, the ritual escalated. It was late, past 2 in the morning. We'd been working on a project for my visual arts class. He'd surprisingly volunteered to help me build some frames, and we were both covered in a fine layer of sawdust, tired but satisfied. He stretched, groaning as his back popped. "I'm too tired to drive back," he said, yawning so wide his jaw cracked. "Mind if I just crash here?" My heart did a slow, painful lurch. He meant the couch, of course. That was the established protocol. I nodded, my throat suddenly dry. "Yeah, of course. I'll get you a blanket." He looked at me, his expression unreadable in the dim light of my work lamp. "Actually," he said, his voice quiet, hesitant, "the couch is killing my back." "Is it? Would it be weird if I just took the floor in your room?" The floor. It was a step, a movement from the public space of the living room to the private space of the bedroom. It was another wall being dismantled, brick by silent brick. I felt a tremor of panic, but my voice, when it came out, was steady. "Don't be an idiot, Ben. My bed's big enough for 2. You can take the other side." The words hung in the air between us, a tangible offer. I hadn't planned to say them. They had just emerged, fully formed, from some braver, more reckless part of myself. I expected him to laugh it off, to make a joke, to insist on the floor. But he didn't. He just looked at me for a long, searching moment. "Yeah," he asked, his voice barely a whisper. "You sure?" "I'm sure," I said, my own voice just as quiet. That night was a new level of exquisite torture. We lay on opposite sides of the mattress, a canyon of white sheets between us, both of us rigidly still, pretending to be asleep. I was so aware of him, it was a physical sensation, like a low-frequency vibration. I could hear every breath he took. I could feel the subtle shift of the mattress when he moved. The air was thick with unspoken things, with the sheer, overwhelming fact of his presence in my bed. I felt like a man walking a tightrope over a vast canyon, the line pulled taut between friendship and something more. One wrong move, one misstep, and I would fall. I didn't sleep at all. I just lay there, staring into the darkness, listening to the sound of my best friend breathing beside me. That, too, became a ritual. The pretense of the couch was abandoned. Now, on the nights he stayed over, which was most nights, it was an unspoken assumption that he would end up in my bed. The initial stiffness gave way to a tentative comfort. The canyon between us slowly narrowed. One night, I woke up to find his arm thrown across my chest, his face buried in my shoulder. I froze, my body instantly rigid with a mixture of terror and elation. I lay there for what felt like hours, not daring to move, just feeling the weight of his arm, the warmth of his breath on my neck. Eventually, he stirred, mumbled something incoherent, and rolled away. In the morning, he didn't mention it. I didn't know if he was unaware it had happened or if he was deliberately ignoring it. That plausible deniability was a killer. It was a space he could retreat into, a fog of ambiguity that protected him, but it left me completely exposed. My life became a series of these liminal spaces. The space between awake and asleep. The space between friendship and love. The space between his side of the bed and mine. I existed in the gray areas, in the unspoken, in the almost. I was a ghost in my own life, haunting the edges of a love story that might only be happening in my own head. My photography reflected it. I stopped taking pictures of people. My work became about empty rooms, about doors left slightly ajar, about the way light fell across an unmade bed. I was trying to capture the feeling of presence and absence, the ache of a space that is filled but still feels empty. I was documenting the architecture of my own yearning. One night, the weather broke. A thunderstorm rolled in, a violent, percussive assault on the city. The rain came down in sheets, and the wind howled against my old, rattling window frames. The lights flickered once, twice, then died, plunging the apartment into a sudden, profound darkness. We were on the couch, the familiar ritual underway, but the power outage changed the atmosphere. The comforting glow of the television was gone, replaced by an inky blackness punctuated by brilliant, momentary flashes of lightning. In those brief, stark illuminations, I could see his face, his eyes wide, his expression stripped of its usual easygoing mask. He looked unnerved, almost childlike. A particularly loud clap of thunder shook the entire building, a deep, guttural roar that vibrated through the floorboards. Ben flinched, a sharp, involuntary jerk, and without a single word, he moved. It wasn't the slow, sleepy lean I was used to. It was a decisive, immediate shift. He closed the remaining distance between us, turning and folding his body against mine, pressing his face into the side of my neck. His arms came around my waist, his hands clutching the back of my t-shirt like he was holding on for dear life. My breath hitched. This was new. This was not the ambiguity of sleep. This was a conscious, deliberate act of seeking comfort, of seeking shelter. He was holding on to me as if I were a lighthouse in the storm. I wrapped my own arms around him, my hand coming to rest on the back of his head, my fingers tangling in his hair. He was trembling, a fine, low-grade tremor that I could feel through his entire body. I held him, murmuring soft, meaningless reassurances, the way you would comfort a frightened child. But he wasn't a child. He was the man I loved, and he was holding me with a desperate, clinging strength that spoke of a need so profound it stole the air from my lungs. We stayed like that for a long time, listening to the storm rage outside. The thunder became a backdrop to the frantic, silent conversation happening between our bodies. In the darkness, with the pretense of the television and the casualness of friendship stripped away, there was only this: his fear and my presence, his need and my willingness to meet it. The storm outside was a pale imitation of the one inside my chest. I felt a tectonic shift, A final, definitive breaking. Something had been given, and something had been received. The door to that locked room inside me wasn't just unlocked. It had been blown off its hinges. The latent image was finally, terrifyingly, starting to come into focus. I just held him tighter, bracing for whatever was about to be revealed. The storm eventually passed, leaving behind a city washed clean and a profound, ringing silence. The power was still out. The darkness in my apartment was absolute, a thick, velvety black. Ben hadn't moved. He was still pressed against me. His trembling subsided, but his arms still locked around my waist. His breathing was deep and even, and for a moment I thought he had fallen asleep. But then he spoke, his voice a low, muffled whisper against my neck, so quiet I almost thought I'd imagined it. "Alex." My heart seized. It was the first word either of us had spoken in over an hour. "Yeah." I managed my own voice hoarse. He was silent for another long moment. I could feel the thoughts turning over in his head, the weight of them. I waited, every nerve ending alight. This felt like a precipice. We were standing at the very edge of something, and the next words would determine whether we flew or fell. "Don't let go." It wasn't a command. It was a plea. 2 words, whispered in the dark, that held the weight of 1,000 confessions. "Don't leave me. Don't abandon me. Stay." It was the most vulnerable thing I had ever heard him say. All the walls he kept around himself, the easy confidence, the casual humor, they were all gone. In the perfect, honest dark, there was only him and his need, raw and exposed. And there was me, the one he was holding on to. A sob, thick and painful, built in my throat, but I swallowed it down. This moment wasn't about my years of quiet pining. It was about him. It was about being the harbor he had chosen in his storm. "I won't," I whispered back into his hair. "I'm not going anywhere." He sighed, a long, shuddering exhalation of breath, and seemed to melt against me, the last vestiges of tension leaving his body. We shifted, a slow, unspoken choreography, until we were lying down on the couch, tangled together, my arm a pillow under his head, his body curled into mine. This was no longer about plausible deniability. This was not a ritual of ambiguity. This was a choice. We were 2 people holding on to each other in the dark, and for the first time, it felt like we were holding on for the same reason. I closed my eyes. The image of his face in the lightning flashes burned onto the backs of my eyelids. The fear was still there, a low thrumming in my blood, but for the first time, it was overshadowed by a fragile, terrifying hope. Maybe, just maybe, the photograph was developing into a picture I could bear to look at. Maybe the language I had been so desperately trying to translate was simpler than I thought. Maybe it was just 2 words. "Don't let go." And in the quiet aftermath of the storm, I knew with a bone-deep certainty that I never would. We must have fallen asleep like that, tangled on the narrow couch, because I woke to the pale, watery light of dawn filtering through the window. My arm was numb, and my neck was stiff, but I didn't move. Ben was still asleep, his face peaceful, his lips slightly parted. The lines of worry that had been etched around his eyes for weeks seemed to have smoothed away. He looked like himself again, but a softer, quieter version. He looked safe. The sight of him, so unguarded and trusting in my arms, was a punch to the gut, a beautiful, breathtaking ache. This felt real. This felt solid. The ambiguity had been washed away by the storm, leaving this clear, simple truth in its wake. I stayed like that for as long as I could, memorizing the moment. The way a strand of his dark hair fell across his forehead. The steady, reassuring rise and fall of his chest against mine. The feeling of his hand resting loosely on my hip. This was my new favorite photograph, the one I would keep in the most protected darkroom of my memory. When he finally began to stir, his eyelashes fluttering, I felt a pang of loss for the perfect stillness we had shared. He blinked, his eyes slowly focusing on my face, just inches from his. There was a moment of disorientation, then recognition, and then something else. A flicker of panic. He pulled back abruptly, disentangling himself from me and sitting up, running a hand through his sleep-messed hair. The space between us, which had been so comfortingly non-existent just moments before, was suddenly a vast, cold chasm. He wouldn't look at me. He stared at the floor, at the wall, at his own hands, anywhere but at my face. He stammered, his voice thick with sleep and something else I couldn't identify. Sorry. About that. The storm. He trailed off, the excuse sounding flimsy even to his own ears. Ben, I started, my voice soft. It's okay. No. I shouldn't have. He stood up, a sudden, jerky movement. He started gathering his things, his keys, his wallet, with a frantic, nervous energy. He was building his walls back up, brick by frantic brick, and I was on the outside. I gotta go. I have that early review session. It was a lie. I knew his schedule as well as my own. His review session wasn't until the afternoon. The lie was a slap in the face. It was a denial of everything that had passed between us in the night. It was a retreat into the fog. Ben, wait, I said, standing up to face him. I reached out, my hand hovering in the air, wanting to touch his arm, to ground him, but I let it drop. He was already gone, his spirit already out the door. I'll see you at practice, he said, his back to me as he walked to the door. He didn't look back. He just opened the door and left, closing it softly behind him. The click of the latch echoed in the silent apartment like a gunshot. I stood there, in the middle of my living room, the phantom warmth of his body still clinging to my clothes, and I felt a cold dread seep into my bones. I had been wrong. The photograph wasn't clear at all. It was overexposed, bleached white with the harsh light of morning, all the delicate details lost. He had run. He had looked at what we were, what we had been in the dark, and he had run from it. And the worst part was, I had let him go. The days that followed were a special kind of hell. Ben was a master of avoidance. At practice, he was all business, the focused team captain, his eyes fixed on the black line at the bottom of the pool. He'd give me a curt nod, a clipped "Hey, Alex," but he never met my gaze. The easy camaraderie was gone, replaced by a tense, formal distance. He didn't come to my apartment. My texts went unanswered. The silence from him was a physical weight, pressing down on me, making it hard to breathe. The sanctuary I had provided for him had become a place he was now actively avoiding. And the reason, I knew with sickening certainty, was me. The hope that had felt so real in the darkness curdled into a bitter cocktail of self-recrimination and hurt. I had been a fool. I had misinterpreted everything. His need for comfort, his vulnerability. I had draped my own desires over them, dressing them up as something they weren't. He hadn't been turning to me. He had just been turning away from his own loneliness. I was a port in a storm, a temporary shelter, and now that the storm had passed, he had set sail again, leaving me on the shore. The thought was humiliating. My quiet, secret love felt like a shameful thing, an indulgence I had allowed to color my perception of reality. I felt exposed, as if he could see the years of pining written all over my face. His avoidance was a confirmation of my worst fear, that he was disgusted. Disgusted by what he thought I wanted, or maybe disgusted by what he himself had briefly, weakly, wanted in the dark. After a week of this agonizing silence, I couldn't take it anymore. The not knowing was eating me alive. I needed to lance the wound, to let the poison out, even if it meant hearing the worst. I saw him leaving the library one evening, his backpack slung over one shoulder, his head down. My heart hammered in my chest, but I forced my feet to move. I fell into step beside him. Ben. He flinched, startled. He glanced at me, his expression guarded, and then looked away again, quickening his pace. Hey, I'm in a hurry. No, you're not, I said, my voice firmer than I expected. You're running, and I need you to stop. Just for 5 minutes. He stopped, but he still wouldn't look at me. He stared at a crack in the pavement, as if it were the most fascinating thing in the world. The silence stretched, taut, and brittle. What happened? I finally asked, my voice cracking on the last word. What happened to us, Ben? 1 minute, you're in my arms, asking me not to let go. The next, you're looking at me like I'm a stranger. You have to talk to me. I deserve that. He finally looked at me, and his eyes were a maelstrom of conflicting emotions. There was guilt and fear and a deep, profound confusion that mirrored my own. "I don't know," he whispered, and the words were so raw, so honest, it was like a physical blow. "Alex, I don't know what happened. I woke up and I panicked." "Panicked about what?" I pressed, my voice gentle but insistent. "About me?" He shook his head, a frustrated, angry gesture. "No, not about you. About me. About that." He gestured vaguely between us. "It felt good, being with you, being held by you. It felt right." And that scared the hell out of me. He finally met my gaze, and his was filled with a desperate, pleading vulnerability. I don't feel that way. About guys. I've never felt that way." The past tense was a knife. "I don't feel that way." He was defining himself, creating a box, and putting himself squarely inside it. A box where I couldn't fit. "I think I made a mistake," he said, his voice barely audible. "I was a mess after Sarah. I was leaning on you, and I think I crossed a line. I used you. And I'm so sorry, Alex. You're my best friend. The last thing I ever wanted to do was mess that up. Or make you think." He trailed off, unable to finish the sentence. "He didn't have to. Make you think I could love you back." The words hung in the air, unspoken but deafening. The hurt was so sharp, so intense, it was almost clarifying. He wasn't disgusted. He was just scared. Scared of what it meant about him, that holding me felt right. He was trying to put the world back into an order he understood, an order where he was straight and I was his friend, and the night of the storm was an anomaly, a fluke, a mistake. I looked at him, at this beautiful, broken, terrified man who was trying to break my heart to save himself from a truth he wasn't ready to face. And in that moment, my own fear fell away, replaced by a surge of anger. Not at him, at the fear itself, at the walls he was so desperately trying to rebuild. "A mistake," I said, my voice low and shaking with an emotion I couldn't control. "Was it a mistake every night you fell asleep on my couch? Was it a mistake every time you chose my bed over your own? Was it a mistake when you held on to me like I was the only thing keeping you from floating away? Were all of those mistakes, Ben?" He flinched, his face pale. He had no answer. "You didn't use me," I continued, my voice gaining strength. "You needed me, and I was there. I have always been there. And that night, in the dark, you weren't thinking about Sarah, and you weren't thinking about what you're supposed to be. You were just you, and I was just me. And you said it yourself. It felt right." I took a step closer, closing the distance he had tried so hard to create. "So don't you dare call that a mistake. It's the realest thing that has happened between us in 4 years." Tears were streaming down my face now, hot and angry. I didn't bother to wipe them away. I wanted him to see them. I wanted him to see the wreckage he was causing. "I love you," I said, and the words, which I had kept locked away for so long, felt like a release, like a final, desperate truth. "I have loved you for years. And maybe that's a problem for you. Maybe that's what you're running from. But don't you dare diminish what we had, what we have, by calling it a mistake. It's not. It's just terrifying. And you're a coward if you let that terror win." I turned and walked away, leaving him standing on the pavement, stunned and silent. I didn't look back. I had laid my entire heart at his feet. I had taken the latent image and thrust it into the light, forcing him to see it. Now it was up to him. He could either turn away from it for good, or he could finally be brave enough to look. The silence that followed our confrontation was different. It wasn't the tense, avoidant silence of the week before. This was a heavy, weighted silence, the kind that follows a detonation. The dust was settling, and I had no idea what the landscape would look like when it cleared. I had said everything. I had torn down my own fortress and left myself completely undefended. There was nothing left to do but wait. The waiting was its own form of purgatory. Every buzz of my phone made my stomach clench. Every knock on my door sent a jolt of adrenaline through me. I went to practice. I went to class. I went through the motions of my life. But I was living in a state of suspended animation, holding my breath, waiting for a verdict. I expected him to retreat for good. I had thrown his fear back in his face, called him a coward, confessed my love in a torrent of hurt and anger. I had made it impossible for us to go back to the comfortable fiction of our old friendship. I had forced a choice. And everything I knew about Ben, his history, his self-perception, his panic, told me he would choose the path of least resistance. He would choose the identity he knew. He would choose to leave. I braced myself for the loss. I started to mourn the friendship in advance, trying to prepare myself for the gaping hole his absence would leave in my life. The ache was constant, a dull throb behind my ribs. 3 days after our fight, I was in my darkroom. It was my truest sanctuary, the one place where I felt in control. The smell of the chemicals, the faint, safe glow of the red light, the methodical process of bringing an image to life. It was a meditation. I was working on the series of empty rooms, trying to capture that feeling of haunted space. I was focused on a print in the developer tray, watching a shadow slowly deepen in the corner of the frame, when I heard a soft knock on the darkroom door. My heart stopped. No one ever knocked on my darkroom door. It was an inviolable space. "Alex," it was Ben's voice. Quiet, hesitant. Not the panicked voice from the sidewalk, but something else. Something subdued. "I'm working," I said, my own voice flat, noncommittal. I didn't want to see him. I wasn't ready for the final rejection. "I know," he said through the door. Can I come in?" Or, "No, that'll ruin your pictures, right?" "It will," I said. There was a long pause. I could hear him breathing on the other side of the door. I imagined him standing there, his hand probably raised to knock again, hesitating. I waited for him to say he'd come back later, or to just leave. "Then I'll wait," he said, his voice so soft I could barely hear it. "I'll just wait out here. For as long as it takes." I stood frozen, the print forgotten in the chemical bath. "For as long as it takes." The words echoed the sentiment of my own promise to him during the storm. It was a reversal. He was the one waiting now. He was the one refusing to leave. Something inside me, a tightly coiled knot of hurt and defensiveness, began to loosen. I took a deep breath, my hands trembling slightly. I carefully moved the print to the stop bath, then the fixer. I turned on the main light, blinking in the sudden, harsh brightness. I walked to the door and opened it. He was sitting on the floor in the hallway, his back against the opposite wall, his knees drawn up to his chest. He looked like he hadn't slept in days. His eyes were shadowed, but when he looked up at me, they were clear. The storm of confusion was gone. What was left was a quiet, sober sadness. And fear. But it wasn't the frantic, panicked fear from before. It was a different kind of fear. It was the fear of a man standing on a high dive, knowing he has to jump. He stood up slowly. We just looked at each other for a long moment, the silent hallway humming with everything that had passed between us. "You were right," he said, his voice raspy. "I was a coward." He took a step closer, and then another, until he was standing right in front of me, so close I could see the faint stubble on his jaw. "I've spent the last 3 days trying to make it not true," he continued, his gaze unwavering. "I tried to convince myself that it was a fluke, that I was just lonely, that it didn't mean anything. I tried to run the code, and it wouldn't compile. The logic was broken, because you were the one variable I couldn't account for, the one thing that didn't fit the program I had written for my life." He reached out, his hand hesitating for a fraction of a second before it came to rest gently on the side of my face. His touch was electric, a jolt of pure, unadulterated truth. It wasn't an accident. It wasn't a gesture of sleepy comfort. It was an intentional, deliberate touch that said everything he couldn't yet articulate. "I'm so scared, Alex," he whispered, his thumb stroking my cheekbone. "I am terrified of what this means, of who I am if this is true, of how to even be this person." His eyes were shining with unshed tears. "But there's only one thing I'm more scared of." "What's that?" I whispered back, my own throat tight. "Losing you," he said, his voice breaking. "Living in a world where you're not my first call, where I can't come to your apartment, where you look at me like a stranger. I tried to imagine that world for 3 days, and I can't. I can't live there. I'd rather be terrified with you than be safe without you." And then, he did what I had only ever allowed myself to imagine in my most secret, foolish dreams. He leaned in slowly, giving me every opportunity to pull away, to stop him. His eyes searched mine, asking a silent question. It wasn't the frenzied, desperate need of the storm. It wasn't the panic of the morning after. It was a quiet, deliberate, terrifyingly honest choice. I didn't pull away. I didn't even breathe. I just stood there and let him come to me. His lips met mine, and it was nothing like I had imagined. It wasn't a passionate, movie-style kiss. It was hesitant. It was tender. It was unbelievably soft. It was a question and an answer all at once. It was the taste of salt from his unshed tears and the feeling of coming home. It was the quiet click of a lock finally finding its key. It was every unspoken word, every moment of shared silence, every secret hope I had ever harbored, finally given a voice. It was a confession, and in the quiet, sterile light of my hallway, outside the room where I developed images in the dark, he brought the most important one of all into the light. He kissed me like he was afraid, but he kissed me like he meant it. And in that moment, I knew that the waiting was over. A new kind of ritual was about to begin. The beginning was not a grand romance. It was a process of careful, quiet construction. We were building something new on the foundations of the old, and we both seemed to understand, without ever saying it, that it required patience. The kiss in the hallway hadn't magically erased his fear, nor had it erased my years of guardedness. It had simply opened a door. Now, we had to learn how to walk through it, together. We spent the rest of that day in my apartment, mostly in silence. But it was a new kind of silence. It was a comfortable, breathing silence, filled not with tension, but with the quiet hum of a shared understanding. We sat on the couch, and he took my hand, lacing his fingers through mine. He studied our joined hands as if they were a complex piece of code he was finally beginning to understand. It was a simple gesture, but it felt monumental. It was an acknowledgement, a public declaration in the private space of our shared world. That night, when it was time for bed, a new, gentle awkwardness settled between us. The old ritual was broken, the pretense gone. He stood by the bed, looking at it, then at me. "Is this okay?" he asked, his voice soft. He was asking for permission, not to sleep in my bed, but to be with me, to share this space with a new intention. I just nodded, my heart too full for words. We got into bed, and for a long time, we lay on our sides, facing each other, the canyon of sheets from that first night, now just a small valley between us. I could see his face in the dim light filtering in from the street. He looked thoughtful, his gaze tracing the features of my face. "What are you thinking?" I whispered. He was quiet for a moment. "I'm thinking," he said slowly, "that for years, I've been trying to build a house. With Sarah, with the plans I had. And I thought the architecture was perfect. But the foundation was all wrong. It was built on sand." He reached across the small space between us and tucked a strand of hair behind my ear, his fingers warm against my skin. "This," he whispered, his eyes holding mine. "This feels like bedrock." He closed the final distance between us then, pressing his forehead against mine. He didn't kiss me again. He just breathed with me, a slow, synchronized rhythm. His hand found mine under the covers. And we fell asleep like that, anchored to each other, two architects who had finally found the right ground on which to build. The rituals of our new life were small, domestic, and deeply comforting. It was in the way he started leaving a toothbrush in my bathroom, a splash of color next to my own. It was in the way I started buying the kind of coffee he liked, without even thinking about it. It was in the way we learned each other's rhythms, the quiet language of a shared life. I learned that he hummed when he was coding, a low, tuneless sound. He learned that I needed a half hour of quiet in the morning before I could properly function as a human being. There were still moments of fear, of course, mostly from him. Sometimes I would catch him looking at me with a flicker of that old panic in his eyes, a brief moment of vertigo as he contemplated the new landscape of his identity. In those moments, I learned not to push. I would just reach for his hand, a silent reassurance, a reminder of the bedrock beneath our feet. And he would hold on, his grip tight, until the moment passed. He was healing, and I was learning that healing isn't a straight line. It's a spiral. Sometimes you have to circle back to the site of the wound to understand how far you've come. My camera, which had been my shield for so long, became a bridge. One afternoon, I found him looking at the prints of the empty rooms I had pinned to my wall. "This is how I felt," he said quietly, pointing to a photograph of my unmade bed, the light from the window falling across one empty pillow. After Sarah left, like a space that was supposed to have someone in it, he then pointed to another, a picture of a doorway, slightly ajar, a sliver of a sunlit room visible beyond. "And this is how I feel now." I didn't ask him to elaborate. I didn't need to. I understood. He was no longer on the outside looking in. He was stepping through the door. I started taking pictures of him again. Not just as the swimmer, the athlete, the force of nature. I took pictures of him asleep in my bed, the morning light soft on his face. I took a picture of his hands, calloused from the gym but gentle, as he worked on a piece of code. I took a picture of him laughing, a real, unguarded laugh, as we cooked a disastrous dinner together. I was no longer just an observer. I was a participant. My art was no longer about yearning. It was about having. We never had a big coming-out conversation with our friends or teammates. It just happened. We started showing up to places together, and we just didn't separate. His hand would find the small of my back. I would lean my head on his shoulder. We existed as a unit, a quiet, undeniable fact. Some people were surprised. Some probably whispered. But the people who mattered, our close friends, our teammates, they just saw that Ben was smiling again. They saw that the light was back in his eyes. And they saw that I was the one standing next to him. And that was enough. The world we had built in the quiet of my apartment slowly, carefully, expanded to include the rest of our lives. One evening, months later, we were on the couch. The same gray couch where it had all begun. A movie was playing, but neither of us was watching. I was reading a book, and he was leaning against me, his head on my shoulder, scrolling through something on his phone. It was so normal, so beautifully, wonderfully mundane, that I was struck by a sudden, profound sense of peace. The weight of his head was no longer a source of frantic analysis. It was just a comfort, a fact, the familiar, beloved weight of my partner. He must have sensed the shift in my attention, because he looked up from his phone and smiled at me. "What?" "Nothing," I said, smiling back. "I was just thinking." "About what?" "About this," I said, gesturing between us. "About how this used to be the most complicated thing in the world for me." He put his phone down and turned his full attention to me. He took my hand, the one that wasn't holding my book, and brought it to his lips, kissing my knuckles. "Is it simple now?" he asked. I thought about it for a moment. I thought about his fears, about my years of silence, about the long and winding road that had brought us to this couch, to this moment. "No," I said honestly. "It's not simple. It's the most complex, terrifying, and beautiful thing I've ever known." I squeezed his hand. "But it's not complicated anymore. There's a difference." He understood. He leaned in and kissed me, a slow, deep kiss that tasted of certainty and shared history. It was a kiss that held the memory of the storm and the promise of the calm. It was the kiss of two people who had navigated the treacherous waters of ambiguity and found a safe harbor in each other. We began to heal in the beautiful, honest silence we'd learned to create together. The quiet rooms of my old photographs were no longer empty. They were filled with the gentle, steady presence of a shared life, of a love that had been developed slowly, carefully, in the dark, and was now, finally, ready for the light. It was a love that had arrived disguised as something ordinary and had, in the end, become everything.